Welcome, everybody, for another episode of Counting on Chazin. We are really excited today because we have Michelle Jellick back with us to talk about something that sometimes I think we get a little mystified about in the nonprofit sector, and that's compliance best practices. So we have Michelle back with us to kind of help us demystify some of these things and help us to understand where we can go wrong and where we can go right. I don't want to lead with the negative, Michelle.
Definitely don't lead with the negative. It's rely on your experts. That's what I say.
I'm loving that. Well, Michelle, being a CPA with Chazin Company, accounting implementation and support manager, I would imagine you've seen it all and you continue to see it all.
Yeah, so we see a lot, and I'm in our onboarding department. So I onboard our new clients. So often we do get clients in high need situations where we have to really focus in on some of these compliance issues and how to make sure they are compliant and get moving in the right direction.
Okay, so that even is more interesting given what this conversation is. And when you're talking to a new client, or even an existing client, and you're bringing them in and you talk
Mhm.
about compliance, can you paint a picture of what that looks like? I know accountants like to use this term GAAP.
Mhm.
And if we could start with that and have you help us figure out who's saying what's compliant and what's not.
Right. So generally accepted accounting principles, if you have an audit, we have to follow those generally accepted accounting principles, which we abbreviate as GAAP. So when you hear us talk about GAAP, we have an accounting standards board who says what we can and can't do and when we can recognize revenue and when we can't. So we have a lot of clients who are smaller and they come in and they're more comfortable in cash basis. So we say if you're married to that cash basis, but you've got to have an audit, let's keep up with those accruals all year. Let's make sure that we're ready for that audit on time because your auditors have standards where they can no longer do this accounting work for you. So you have to be able to provide them with good numbers now. And they used to be able to help us with our accruals and those things. They can't do that anymore. So that's where we come in.
So it's really almost, if you will, a lens
Mhm.
to, and I don't want to rephrase what you've said, but I want to make sure that we're on track. It's a lens with which we all should be using the same terminology, understanding the same policies and procedures. I gotta believe that that's where things can go off the rails a bit, because help me with this concept. It's not the same from state to state, right? When we talk about compliance issues, I mean,
Sure.
GAAP is there. GAAP is a fed or a national piece, right? But within the states, we can have differences.
So what we can have different within the states is whether or not we need that GAAP audit.
Okay.
Because, for example, California's rule is that if you have over $2 million in revenue, you need an audit to keep your charitable solicitations permit. In Tennessee, that limit is 500,000. So it depends on where you're incorporated.
Interesting.
Mhm.
And I would imagine that's changing year to year across this nation, right? I mean,
Sure. So the states do realign their goals. Some raise them, some lower them. And so we have to just stay abreast of that and look at where you're incorporated and where you're filing that charitable solicitations permit.
wow. So that's like a whole nother issue, which
Yes.
is like pretty intense. Another issue that we're seeing, and I can't wait to have you talk about this with us, is that thing that you started to mention, and that's the donor certification compliance issue that's outside the state of where you're incorporated. I gotta believe that this is even more powerful of a discussion because we have so many donors that are donating digitally.
Correct, and we have to stay on top of that. Some of our organizations need to file in multiple states for a charitable solicitation permit. And one of we have some startups that are C6s and they're soliciting in multiple states. Maybe you're incorporated in Georgia, but you have a fundraising dinner in California. You need to also have that charitable solicitations permit in California. So those are things we try to look for, and that has become much more common, particularly as we've all become more virtual in the last couple of years.
So let me ask you this, with so many nonprofits, and the American Nonprofit Academy, we go by the number 1.8 million registered nonprofits in our country. That's the number that we settle on internally with my company. And I know there are groups that say, no, there's 1.4, I mean, up to 2.2. But anyway, let's just pick this middle of the road number, 1.8 million. Is this the sort of thing that somebody would go and really think about their compliance issue before they start soliciting, or do they wait until they start to see things coming in from different states? Because with all this virtual, and digital donating, how do you figure that out?
Well, I think you should look at what type of organization that you are. So if you're a Get Out the Vote organization, and we have some C6s that are, you're most likely seeking funds from other states. So go ahead and be proactive. If you know you're going to be going to California, or you know you're going to New York to have a fundraising dinner, then definitely go ahead and apply in those states that you know. If you're applying for grants from a foundation, and maybe you're a Tennessee foundation, but there's a Tennessee nonprofit, and there's a North Carolina foundation that gives you money, you need to be registered in both states. So just take a look at where your funders are.
I love that you put that in context, because I've been thinking about this with this concept as like the donor sitting there with their phone, and they read something in the paper, read something online, or see something on TV, and then they push to donate. But that's powerful that you pulled the lens back a little bit to include our funders and our donor investors. That's powerful. Thank you. So that's a huge compliance issue. Another one that I think sometimes that we're not thinking about, and I really would love to get your feedback on this, is payroll tax. Now, again, with work from home, and we have people that aren't necessarily in our same communities, a lot of this reshuffle from the pandemic. How is that looking?
So that's an important aspect of compliance that we don't always think about, because now that so many folks are work from home, I might be a DC nonprofit, but I have an employee in Virginia, and I have an employee in Maryland, and I have an employee in DC. I need payroll tax IDs for all three of those entities, those bodies, governing bodies, and I need to remit withholdings to Virginia and Maryland because DC doesn't have them. But we also see, for example, in Ohio, we have local taxes that have to be withheld and remitted. So we had a client who was in Ohio, and their accountant hadn't remitted those local taxes. So that can be a sticking point. And one of the things that I caution you on is make sure you have those state tax ID numbers, because just because you're using a payroll processor doesn't mean they're getting those numbers for you. And often it is someone from the organization who has to sign the paperwork and be responsible for that number. So that's important. And even if the state doesn't have an income tax, for example, Tennessee, where I live, doesn't have a state income tax, but nonprofits have to report payroll for state unemployment. So you are still required to have a state tax ID.
So you kind of gave me the shivers there a little bit, because you kind of highlighted a compliance issue. Because you're using a third-party payroll company or payroll professional, you still need to stay on top of this.
Yes, and so they may be able to remit the tax for you, but they can't remit it until you have the number. So they'll often come back to you to get that number for yourself. So that's just something to know, that others can't get the number for you, but it is an important thing to stay on top of.
Wow. And then another compliance before we go on to in a different direction, somewhat. are those 1099s. And as we have more part-time staff and
Mhm.
contract labor, that becomes another compliance issue that maybe we hadn't really been thinking about before, right?
Yes, and so that's very important because that's a federal return that we have to file, and they're due January 31st, just like our W-2s. But our contractors, anybody that we paid over $600, we have to send them a 1099 and report to the federal government on our Form 1096, those things that we withheld.
Wow, so much. So we've covered donors, we've covered, labor, contractors. We've talked about work from home and all these different things that are
Mhm.
moving us into different levels of compliance. I want to kind of touch back on the IRS 990. Now we have some other episodes with Counting on Chazin that go into the 990 and really what I think is a great opportunity document, and
Yes,
that it helps. It should be you should think of it almost as like a brochure, but that's another conversation. Um, do you have to, and correct me if I'm wrong, can you or do you have to um, document on that IRS 990 form that you are in compliance in certain areas?
you do. And so that 990 is due for every 501c3, 501c6, 501c9, and it's an informational return, but it is due. And if you have over 50,000 in revenue, you have to fill out the full form. Under 50, there's a little postcard form you can fill out. But the full form has several things with compliance related. If you look at your form, you'll see a bunch of yes, no check boxes.
Okay.
An important one that we want to make sure we've read all of those yes, no check boxes and we agree with them. But one that we don't always think about is our board conflict of interest policy. And it does ask us that on our 990, and we have to check, yes, that we have one, and then we actually have to have one.
Good point.
Yeah. And our board members need to be aware. So one way that we like to suggest documenting that our board not only is aware of that policy, they should be reviewing and approving it as a governing body, but we should also have our board members sign saying that they've reviewed it and they have no conflicts, or if they do, list what those conflicts are. Maybe they're on also on the board of one of our major funders, and they may abstain from voting if a vote related to our grant seeking opportunity comes up. So, but those are the types of things that are compliance that we have to think about and that we want to be responsible for.
I love that. And that is a compliance issue. Help me to understand that a little bit more. Is that something that should be done every year?
Yes. So your board
Okay.
every year needs to disclose any conflict of interest that they may have.
Okay. Awesome. Really, really interesting. I think you also shared with us in another episode for Counting on Chazin that you should have a whistleblower policy, and that's a compliance issue as well.
Yes, you should have a whistleblower policy, and it should be available to your staff, and your board should know about it. And within that policy, you should have someone that staff can go to besides just your finance director, or just your ED. You may want to have an audit committee or a board treasurer who's responsible for whistleblower complaints.
And that's also disclosed that you have that in the yes no boxes that you just mentioned.
Yes.
Okay, interesting. Wow, so compliance is pretty heavy duty, and there's a lot to be thinking about and tracking. And as you let off, it sounds to me like it's changing, quite a bit. So how do you keep up with all this? I mean, you only know what you know, and so how do we navigate all these things coming at us?
Well, sure. So for 990 in federal compliance, you would generally have a CPA firm prepare that and sign it for you. So be in constant communication with them, talk to them about any new changes, or talk to them about changes in your programs. You could have added something that needs to be disclosed on your 990, or you could have started say you sold some things and you needed to report unrelated business income, we need to be aware of that and make sure we report that correctly. So it's about that, really staying in touch with your CPA and really telling them about what's going on in your business, what's new or different.
Interesting. Now you talk about also having an accounting manual and an SOP kind of control
Mhm.
manual piece as well. Could you share with us a little bit about what that means and how we might use that in terms of compliance?
So sure, you should have an accounting manual that covers all of your policies and procedures, including grant seeking and grant making, but that should cover audit and who's responsible for the audit and who reviews and approves the audit. And that really should be also done at your board level. If you have a large board, you should form an audit committee or a finance committee that oversees your audit and your 990, but your board should be reviewing and improving that document as well, because as board members, we do have a fiscal responsibility.
Yeah, absolutely. Another thing that you kind of touched on just now, and that's the board review process. When you what you just mentioned, should that be actually written or memorialized in a policy like that standard operating procedures book, or is that a little bit more flexible? Help me understand that.
So I think for your board to fully and everyone to understand their roles, that should be outlined. And that review of your draft audit financial statement and your board having at least a high level understanding of what's behind those numbers. And then also your board should review and approve your 990 before it's signed and issued so that they understand what's in it and what's disclosed.
Mhm. Yeah. It's also so frightening to kind of hear this because in 30 years of board service, I never remember a time when it wasn't all done and kind of like, here it is, this is what was
Mhm.
filed. Never that opportunity. And I've never sat on a finance audit committee, so that's different. But it's just generally, it seems like it's taken care of and you just, okay, next. And which is really, I'm hearing from you, a pretty big mistake.
Sure, because all board members have a fiduciary duty. Now, if you have the luxury of having a finance committee or an audit committee in place, they would dive into the detail a little bit more. However, it should be explained to the board and presented to the board by your accounting firm. And then that 990 has every board member's name is listed. So you want to make sure that you approve with what's in there.
Yeah. And then last but not least, I mean, for any of those that you've been joining us on Counting on Chazin, or if you know me or you've worked with me in other parts of what I do with the American Nonprofit Academy, I'm a big proponent of having a board liaison. It's that professional person that helps administrate things between management and the board. And one of the tips you give us, which I think is really smart, is that we should be calendarizing all of these reporting dates so that we know. I mean, we can check off, okay, yeah, we did this, we did that. Um, Help us with that a little bit more. Is that something that you would share with your CPAs and make sure that you are in compliance?
Sure. So I think if you don't have an outsourced accounting firm doing these things for you, for example, we have like on my task list for my clients, I have a task that's going to 3 or 4 days before the quarterly 941 is due. I have a task that alerts me to review that and make sure it's filed timely. If I know that the 990 is due August 15th, then I have a task that alerts me to double check in July with my client's accounting firm. Are we prepared to file this timely? So that's the kind of thing that you should do, and work directly with your accounting firm or your outsourced accountant to make sure that these things are being done. But if you are processing payroll in-house or yourself approving payroll, make sure those things are on your calendar. Let's make sure we're filing our state and local payroll tax timely and our federal payroll tax. And the other thing we sometimes forget about is also compliance, and our responsibility is if we have a 403B plan or a 401k plan, we only have so many days after the pay period to remit the funds timely, or we owe interest to the plan.
Wow, I love it. Okay, now I want to go back across that board table, if you will, the conference room table, and talk about board compliance actions, like what the board member, when they come to an organization what they are individually responsible for, and as a whole what they're responsible for, because you use that, to me, a magical phrase, fiduciary responsibility, and talking about that heavy burden, and attitude and mindset that we need to have across our nonprofits. Some of those board compliance actions, walk us through that. I mean, you've talked about the highest level understanding of
Mhm.
finance, and that really becomes a compliance issue, right?
It really does. So in addition to reviewing that audit in 990, the board should at a minimum review those quarterly financial statements, compare last quarter to the current quarter. Does it make sense? For example, we sometimes catch that payroll taxes aren't remitted timely because that accrual is larger this quarter than it was last quarter. Why is it larger? It shouldn't be. What changed? So it's really just taking that high level analytical look at not just the statement of activity, what did we earn or not earn, or how much did we spend over budget, but look at those statement of financial position items. Do they look reasonable? Are they comparing to prior months? And if they're not, let's ask the question why. But another area that I say boards should be involved is approving that accounting manual. They should be reviewing and approving that periodically and making sure those policies are in place and that they understand what's in place.
Let me ask you something that might seem like a little in the weeds, but following this conversation with you, which I think is fascinating, I'm almost wondering, is this the sort of thing that we try and almost like jam together in the January meeting so that we know moving forward we have a compliance strategy? Because things are changing. Obviously, this isn't like a one agenda item, but is
Sure.
that a good idea or not?
It is. So I would say even in the month or the quarter before year end, let's talk about what we want, how our business strategy is changing next year, and then updating our policies and so forth to be current. Um, eh, what's changing? What do we need to do different? Or what's changing in laws? And so I think addressing it before year end is better than after.
I like that, and I'm glad I asked the question because, I'm like linear in my brain, thinking, okay, you organize the meeting and you have the meeting, and da, 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 da. But you're right; it's too late at that point, and then you're behind the gun. If you move forward before that, then you can make adjustments. And to your point, redescribing some of those compliance issues like the COI policy or the whistleblower. I mean, there are a lot of different things. HIPAA laws. If you are in a medical related human services capacity, you need to sign off on those compliance issues too. So I appreciate you kind of giving us some ideas. Now, last but not least, and we've really asked you, I feel like we peppered you with so many questions, but this is such an important thing. I'm really curious about, you talk about compliance and communication.
Mhm.
And because so much of this seems like it's an internal in the weeds thing, but you're saying no, you need to share some of this with your donors, your funders, your stakeholders, and your staff. Why and how do we do that?
So with our staff, we should make that accounting manual available and our policies and our SOPs available to everyone. So have a shared network where those things are available and make sure they know where that's kept. And then with our audit and our financials and our 990, we have a duty to post that on our website so that our donors and funders can see it. And honestly, there are pieces, that statement of functional expenses. I'm sure you've heard us talk about that. But that's a piece that your funders are very interested in. They want to see that on your 990, and they want to see that in your audit, and they want to see where their money's going. So those two things, having those on your website, I see a lot of my nonprofits have their strategic plan available on their website because then their funders can see where they're going as well.
I love that. And I think that is, Michelle, that when we were all talking about this, it seems like all the time, with the great resignation coming out of the pandemic, global changes in economies, we have more and more reliance upon getting our information from the web and not in the office around the water cooler. So it just seems to me like this is a really important piece. And I'd also love to get your feedback on how this might impact our relationships with future staff or retaining staff. I mean, how do you see this playing out when our staff sees that we're compliant or thinking about that? Does that impact them?
Sure. So right now, folks do have a lot of options when it comes to jobs, and they want to work for an organization that's cream of the crop. They want to know that you have a good cash flow, so they can see that on your 990. I would recommend that anybody pursuing a career do their homework. So of course, they're going to see your financials are available and your 990s available. They're going to see that it's current. If you're just now posting 2020 because you haven't done 21 or 22, then you're going to have to be honest about that, because folks are doing their homework, and those things are available, whether it's on GuideStar or Giving Matters or just on your website. They're going to look at that. But those documents tell them a lot, not just about your cash flow. It's got your compliance in there because you have all those yes, no check boxes checked. And then it's also got your programs identified and your statement of functional expenses, and they can see from that where your dollars are going.
I love it. I mean, you've really opened the door, I think, to looking at compliance in a lot of different ways. That it's not just do this, don't do that, go to jail, whatever the heck. But looking at this as communication, marketing, if you will. We use the phrase cause selling when we're trying to build trust in relationships with donors, investors, and funders. I'm seeing today, this is really an important piece of that wheel, if you will.
Sure, because all of your donors, your funders, they're all doing their homework as well. So it's an opportunity to prove to them that you are doing what you should be and you're doing it well.
Right, and you're doing it well. Well, this has been great. Once again, you've demystified a lot of things for us in the nonprofit sector. The accounting world, for so many of us, can be threatening, and it can strike a lot of fear. And I think we rush to our accountants oftentimes in crisis. And if we could understand things a little bit better up front, just that tip that you gave us about don't review all of your policy and compliance issues at the first January meeting. Hello, step back so that you're ready for that year. That was like a light going off. I'm on two boards that I'm going to send off an email on that one when we're done today. But wow, Michelle Gillick, CPA, the Accounting Implementation and Support Manager for Chazin Company. Thank you so much for coming on Counting on Chazin with us and helping us to understand why compliance is important and how we can manage it to our best interest of our nonprofit. I really appreciate it.
Thank you.
Hey, it's been great. Everybody, we have a lot more episodes on Counting on Chazin. Things are always changing, as Michelle mentioned. Just the issue of state to state, regulations and policies and things that we need to understand. So don't forget to check out our website, Counting on Chazin, as well as chazinandcompany.com. You will find a lot more information that will help you to make your nonprofit stronger and more mission focused. Thanks so much. We're going to see you back here on another episode of Counting on Chazin very soon.